You're listening to On Shifting Ground from World Affairs and KQED. I'm Ray Suarez. Back in May, I headed to the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation meeting in Detroit, Michigan. Our producers were working behind the scenes to schedule an interview with Shawn Fain, president of the United Auto Workers. In the weeks leading up to our trip, Fain was playing hardball with President Biden on the administration's ambitious plan for an electric vehicle future. Our team knew the union president would be a power broker at the summit. Since we first aired our program on Detroit and the international electric vehicle revolution, the UAW has called a strike against the Big Three American automakers. It's just the latest strike in the year of labor. The UAW is asking for a 36% raise over the course of a 4-year contract. Right now, the two sides remain at an impasse over the salary demands. The underlying issue, how a transition to EV technology may endanger the job security of assembly line workers, has no clear road to resolution. Much of the strike coverage has focused solely on the salary dispute, ignoring the role of EVs. To better understand why the auto workers are on the picket lines, we're re-airing my conversation with Shawn Fain, and we dive deeper into the challenges facing Motown with Detroit Free Press reporter Mark Phelan.
When the Big Three have realized $250 billion in profits in the last decade, and workers' wages have remained stagnant, there's a problem.
After a question about the UAW maintaining a seat at the political table, I followed up with the automaker's new leader.
Can we talk more about that seat at the table? The administration has sketched out, both in general and in specific, a transition, a creation of a new industry, the charging stations, the sourcing of the batteries, and so on. Isn't this an opportunity? The union has expressed misgivings about this policy. Isn't the creation of a new industry a golden opportunity for your members?
It's a great opportunity. We have to get it right, and that's the issue is, let's look at the groundwork that's being laid right now. It's not right. When we have workers, I'll go back to Altium in Lordstown, Ohio, starting out at $16.50 an hour and taking 7 years to get to $20 an hour. That is cutting in half our established standard in the auto industry right now, in the powertrain industry. The powertrain, the engines and transmissions are what drive our vehicles. We view the battery as no different. It's a different technology, but it's the same process. So the wage standards should, at a minimum, be the same. And when we look at this battery work, there's a lot more technology involved. So a typical worker that comes into an auto plant right now may be adding a part to a process or a part to something. When you look at the battery plants, these workers are working with HMIs, which is a computer screen as a human-machine interface is what HMI stands for. But they are literally watching the process on screens, and then they're dealing with that. And so there's a lot more training involved in that. There's a lot more aspects to that, that the workers need to understand and be trained in. But there's also a safety element to this. There are chemicals right now in these battery plants that aren't regulated by OSHA. So there are things that have to happen through the EPA and other means so that we understand the chemicals workers are working with. We have workers that are being exposed to chemicals and passing out. They're becoming sick. We've had a fatality at Lordstown. We've had an explosion there. We've had chemical spills where people's the soles off of shoes were burned off. So this is not just a simple thing, and people need to understand the value of these jobs and the risk in these jobs. And again, we're not asking for astronomical conditions. We're asking for people's fair, equal share in the process.
That press conference was back in May. In the months since, the White House has made little progress in courting UAW support. In mid-July, President Biden had a private meeting with Shawn Fain, but no agreement has been announced. The stalemate is likely to drag into the presidential primaries in 2024 as Biden and the Republican field vie for Rust Belt voters. While I was interviewing APEC officials in Detroit, just outside the hotel, protesters representing local labor and trade coalitions, including the UAW, held signs and banners that read, "No to APEC, not in our city," and "Labor rights before profit." These demonstrations spoke to the anxiety many auto workers are feeling. I sat down with Mark Phelan, auto writer and columnist for the Detroit Free Press, to break down why the threat of EVs is a red line for the UAW.
We spoke to the head of the UAW, and I asked him about the Biden administration's electric vehicle initiative, and he was not happy. Why? What is it about this new industry that has them seeing threat instead of opportunity?
It's not the industry. It's the fact that electric vehicles require far fewer people to put them together than gasoline-powered vehicles. An engine has got thousands of parts. An electric motor has got about 10. So they're looking at huge numbers of good-paying blue-collar jobs that could go out the window. And societally, we haven't addressed that enough yet.
But you still need sheet metal and windshields and car radios and all the other things, and windows that go up and down. I mean, there's still a lot of work.
There's still a ton of work, but the most complicated and most labor-intensive pieces in a car are the engine and the transmission. And both of those essentially go away with the transition to electric vehicles. Electric motors are very simple. At some point, they will probably need some transmissions with multiple gears, but they don't yet. So that's part of the reason that all of the battery plants that are being built around the country are such an intense area of focus for the unions, because battery manufacturing is an entirely new segment and it is reasonably labor intensive. So they're working very hard to get the automakers to guarantee that the plants that make batteries, many of which are joint ventures between the automakers and a battery company, the UAW wants those to be guaranteed union representation. So far, the automakers are saying, hey, it's fine with us if the guys vote for it, but we got a partner. We can't force them. So it's an open question. And if I were Sean Phelan, it'd be the top question on my mind right now.
If you're the governor of Michigan, how are you looking at it? Does Michigan in general, which has long been a home of this industry, not just in Detroit, but scattered all around the state, parts, assembly, once again, not a right-to-work state? Once again, a Democratic governor who's in good odor with the administration in Washington. What's in this transition for Michigan?
Potential for jobs, both to protect jobs that already exist and to attract new jobs. There are at least 3 of the big battery plants that I've been talking about that are going to be built in Michigan. Those were huge gets for the state. But on the other hand, Ford is building its biggest battery and manufacturing assembly, I think, anywhere on earth in Tennessee and Kentucky. And that was an embarrassing loss for the state. So they're working very hard to try to get as much of the investment as they can and to try to make sure that all of the automakers that already exist keep in mind the fact that Michigan's got natural resources and a skilled workforce. Even when the state was a right-to-work state, we never managed to lure any assembly plants from any Japanese or German companies. They've been springing up throughout the South. They would love to get one of those, but it doesn't look like it's going to happen.
When Volkswagen was getting ready to put its new plant in Tennessee, the state government actually interposed itself in that process, and it could, because there were a lot of tax rebates and incentives built into the structure of the plan, and said, we don't want unions. Even if you, Volkswagen, corporate, back in Wolfsburg, say, yeah, we'd actually rather talk to a union. We're going to pull back our state money if you move ahead by talking to the UAW. It was a striking moment, I think, in the history of collective bargaining in this country, to have a state government tell a foreign investor that the deal's off if you talk to organized labor. That won't happen here, obviously. But is that ominous for a man like Sean Phelan?
Oh, it has to terrify him. And the UAW has been trying to organize the Japanese and later German and Korean assembly plants that dot the Southeast for a generation. And they have made no headway whatsoever. Part of it is because the workforce there doesn't have much experience with unions and there is an antipathy to them. And part of it is that the state governments and the local governments are not interested in helping in any way. They have tried every foreign-owned plant in the country. They have tried to organize, and they have yet to get any of them other than the legacy plants or the ones that are owned partially by one of the domestic automakers.
It's not for nothing that they're going to Tennessee and Kentucky and Georgia and South Carolina.
Absolutely. There was some pushback last year, though. Ford was going to invest in a battery plant, and a battery plant is a massive investment. It's billions of dollars to build a battery plant, 1,000 people working in it, lots of subsidiary jobs all around it. A battery plant or a car assembly plant can change the economy of a region, which is very much what happened to Chattanooga when Volkswagen built their plant there. A year ago, Ford was planning on putting a battery plant in Virginia. The governor of Virginia said, hey, wait a minute, your partner's a Chinese company. I don't approve of the Chinese government. We're not going to give any of the subsidies that we had been talking about. Ford pulled out, and we can't say the exact same plant, but coincidentally, another plant of about the same size was announced late last year to be built in Western Michigan.
Western Michigan, a region of the state with many beaten down post-industrial cities. That's good economic policy, but it's probably good politics too.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And the region is changing. It's become much more of a tech hub, and the political habits are changing as well. It was very heavily dominated by evangelical conservatives, and it's become a bit more inclusive over the last 10, 12 years.
This is a city that has seen some really bad days. And it's sad to go out into the further reaches of the place and see the skeletons of former plants that made parts, that did assembly, that were part of ancillary industries that supplied the Big Three. How do you convince the rest of the world and the rest of the industry that Detroit's not over, that it's still got a lot to offer?
Well, it's an ongoing challenge, frankly. I mean, if you look at the change over the last decade, it's stunning. The residential vacancy rate in the core downtown, where we are standing and for a mile or so in every direction, is under 1%. And penthouses in the hotel where we're sitting right now are going for over $1 million. But there are also areas that are vacant, and there's been so much depopulation of the city that there are some areas that it would make more sense, frankly, to let them go back to, wilderness or park. The resources have gone down, but there's a skilled workforce. There's more engineers in the Detroit area than any other comparably sized area in the country, possibly the world. So there's a huge workforce for not just for making stuff, but for development. And Microsoft, Google, they all have outposts here, and every big automotive supplier in the world does as well. And increasingly, that includes more semiconductor work and battery technology. So it's an ongoing thing. The city will never be at the size population that it was, in the past, because the suburbs exist, frankly. But it's gotten better, and they need to do it one job and one factory at a time.
Can the broader region make a pitch to the industry as it is, that it's got what it needs? There have been fraught histories of race relations. There's been disinvestment, abandonment, decay. If you Google Detroit, it's not a bunch of happy stories that pop up on your laptop. Without a sort of unrealistic Chamber of Commerce promotional film way, but a hard-nosed dollars and cents pitch, is Detroit and the region fanning out and saying, no, we are worth putting $1 in because you'll get much more than $1 out?
That's what they're working on. And again, the skilled workforce is in place, the number of engineers here, the educational system. There's 3 large research institutions within an hour-and-a-half drive. There's a lot of infrastructure. There's a very multicultural population. People come from all over the world. People have been coming from all over the world to Detroit for 300 years, but the last century, it's been primarily because of the auto industry. First, people coming for jobs in the plants, when you could make $5 a day here and not touch that anywhere else on earth. And today, people are coming because this is where so much of the intellectual capital of the auto industry exists, and so much research work is done. So there's a skilled workforce, there's a beautiful area, and there's a city that has got great potential. I mean, the myth of Detroit almost always outweighs the reality of Detroit. And for a generation, the myth of Detroit was that it is a post-apocalyptic Thunderdome where no one is safe at any given moment. It was never that bad. And a few years ago, the myth became, it's Paris in the 20s. It's the place where you can get a cheap apartment and all of the young creatives are flooding out of Brooklyn and going to Detroit. And there were a number of them who did that, but that was also an overstatement. So the reality is always somewhere in the middle. But the reality is that the metro area has got 5 million people. The city of Detroit has suffered greatly, but most of the money and middle and upper class people who lived in the city of Detroit 40 years ago still live in the region. They just live outside the city limits. So the region can attract businesses and investment. It's very important for the city to continue to grow, to improve resources, to continue the flourishing of residential and industrial construction that's gone over the last few years. And I mean, one thing we're not running out of is vacant buildings that can be repurposed.
One of the most interesting conversations of the 2012 election year was the disagreement between Barack Obama and Mitt Romney over the wisdom of saving General Motors, helping it restructure. You have a front seat to that drama. Play out what it could have meant to this city if General Motors had been fully allowed to collapse, if, as Mitt Romney suggested, business nature had been allowed to take its course.
It would have been disastrous, and not just for the city or the state of Michigan or even the Great Lakes and the industrial Midwest. It would have been a disaster for the whole country because the knock-on effects of automaking are massive. I mentioned earlier, an assembly plant changes the economic reality of a city. And if they had all closed, if the research and development work that is done on the new technologies were no longer happening here, it would have been devastating to the whole country. If GM had closed down, the domino effect would have taken down half of the automotive suppliers in the country, auto dealerships in every little town across the country. It would have been almost impossible to recover. After the Great Recession, I heard an analyst from one of the big financial houses, I regret to say I don't remember who it was or I'd credit it to him. He was talking and he said, if anybody thought that the auto industry is pure, unchecked capitalism, I hope this proved to you that it's wrong. It's too big. It is too interwoven with all of the other industries and with the educational systems and the finance and intellectual systems in every country. If you have it, you have to preserve it. Germany knows that. Japan knows that. Happily, during the Great Recession, the United States knew it. And, GM has added people. It's one of the leading companies in terms of investment in technology in the transition to electric vehicles. It's generated billions of dollars of profits. It was a good investment.
It was interesting to hear the head of a major American labor union express his unhappiness with a Democratic administration. Is this an inside the family fight that'll eventually get worked out, or are there really hard, structural, different points of view that are going to be rough to harmonize here?
There are serious concerns, and there are ends of the circle that are hard to make meet today. I mean, the transition, there's no way that the transition to electric vehicles can be made without the loss of some jobs. And most industrialized countries are better at planning for that kind of thing than the United States is. We tend to think you're on your own. The union doesn't want people left on their own when their transmission plant closes down. They want some kind of a plan. They want assurances. And Democrats have to strike a balance that is good for both of the unions and the engineers and executives and all the other people who work and the customers of the companies. So there will be compromises. I don't think that the positions that the sides are taking are in any way impossible to find a common ground on. But if I were a member of the UAW, I would want my union president banging the table and saying, protect my jobs. We've supported you. Show us we were right.
It sounds like, well, from both what you and the UAW are saying, that it's already accepted as a given that even if there is a lot of work created by this massive transition, I mean, to move away from the internal combustion engine is a big deal. But the assumption seems to be that there won't be just other kinds of jobs created, but there will be at the end of the road a net loss. Is that fair?
I think that there will be other kinds of jobs created. I don't know that that's part of the UAW's bargaining position, and perhaps it shouldn't be. They want to make the strongest case that they can for protecting the jobs that they've already got. But, I mean, the history of industrialization, the history of the United States, is that jobs shift, but the economy tends to grow. 100 years ago, what was the proportion of people who were working in agriculture? It will change. There will be more new kinds of jobs that we can't imagine yet, but it would be a disaster for the country if there's a gap between the end of the current jobs and the new jobs that are created, or if there were hundreds of thousands of people who fell into a trough because there was no bridge between those two things.
Does the UAW have a right to be wary because promises made in earlier generations about retraining, about upskilling, about skills transfer just didn't work out?
Absolutely. There is no history of those promises delivering what was expected. And they should not just be wary, but they should have a concrete plan. Be part of the solution and tell us, how do you think we can help these people? What are the areas that you see that you can provide work for the companies? I mean, it has to be something where everybody is at the table.
One of the most striking events of the last generation for an old reporter was to see Michigan, of all places, become a right-to-work state. Help the listener understand just why that was such a big deal and what it means.
Well, Michigan is traditionally a state that has a large union presence, largely because the United Auto Workers, they were based here. So many of the auto plants were based here. And that meant that for generations, there were families that didn't have to worry what the kids were going to do. They were going to go and work at Ford's, people around here call it. Go work at Ford's. They'd work for GM. They would do the same kind of job in the same factory that their parents had did. Then the economy changed. Fewer people were needed to build the cars. There's more competition. And a lot of those jobs went away. And the movement to reduce unions' bargaining position gained strength. And there was a moment when the Democrats in the state legislature overplayed their hand. They tried to put in a law that would require unions to be present in many places. And when that failed, the Republicans were emboldened and they said, well, if you didn't have enough people to pass that law, maybe we can get the first thing on our wish list, which is a right to work law, which means that you can't have a business where everybody who works in it has to belong to the union. There can be people who do not belong to the union, they do not pay dues, but they may get many of the same benefits that the union bargains for. That law was in place for probably about 20 years, and it was a real shock to the system of a lot of people in Michigan when it happened, and it greatly weakened the labor movement. The new administration and legislature have repealed it, and now if you are part of a business that has union representation, you pay whether you feel like joining the union or not. And that was a huge victory for the unions in the state. And it'll be very interesting to see if there's any pushback, if it has any effect on the attempts to lure new investment. When you look at the total value of a finished car, direct labor is generally conceded to be around 6-7%. So I don't think just the cost is a problem, but there are companies all over the world who have jumped through hoops in order to build cars in states across the United States that don't have a strong union presence.
One of the big, important motifs of labor corporate relations in the auto industry has been pattern bargaining. When the UAW would make a deal with one of the big three, that would set the template for the other two. There was no way GM was going to make a deal with the UAW that then Ford was going to undercut significantly. Does the UAW still have that kind of clout? Or is that really a relic of another time in industrial relations?
It still exists. There will still be sometime this summer. All the three major companies' contracts with the UAW all expire this fall. And there will at some point be a moment when the union decides this is the one that we are going to focus our negotiations on. And when we've got a deal with them, we will apply that model to the other two. It's called the target, and it's always a matter of great interest in Detroit which one will be the target. There is a history of the union being interested. If they want money, they go to GM. If they want flexibility and creativity, they go to Ford. There's some truth to that and some apocrypha, but that's part of what we're looking at this time. And they gave up a lot of things during the bankruptcy, during the Great Recession. There's some that they want to get back. It takes a long time for a new hire to get up to the same pay that somebody who's been working for their whole career. They want to shorten that. They want to reduce the number of almost permanent but temporary workers that exist because they're not members of the union. So they want to work on those things. But we will see. It'll be very interesting, but there will be a pattern, but it's never an absolute cookie cutter. There are differences from one to the other. And one of the things that most people don't know is that each manufacturing facility has its own plant-specific contract as well. And a lot of times when you hear about a strike that's localized, it's because management at that plant and the union at that plant couldn't agree on something within those areas. That's an ongoing thing. But yeah, there will be a deal that is the pattern, and everybody else will fall in line within certain outlines.
That was Mark Phelan, auto writer and columnist for the Detroit Free Press. Mark, thanks a lot for joining us.
My pleasure.
You've been listening to On Shifting Ground, produced in partnership with KQED, with funding from listeners like you. Today's episode was produced by Adam Ailey, Elise Manukian, Sienna Barnes, and Andrew Stelzer. It was mixed and mastered by Matteo Schimpf. Additional production and engineering were provided by Rob Spate. KQED's Jim Bennett is our technical supervisor. Jared Sport is our executive producer. Philip Yun is CEO of World Affairs. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ray Suarez. Thanks for listening.